Welcome to the podcast, everyone. Let's dive into one of the most tangled theological webs where the figures of Simon Magus, Paul, and Marcion spark some explosive theories.
I'm pumped to get into this. It's like unraveling a mystery where every thread challenges the tradition.
Right. So we know Simon Magus is cast in Acts as a sorcerer and deceiver, while Paul is the celebrated apostle whose letters form the backbone of early Christian thought. And then there's Marcion, who takes Paul's writings and turns them into a radical gospel free from the Old Testament.
And what's crazy is how these figures almost seem to merge into one another in early accounts. Like, some scholars even hint that they were perhaps literary reflections of the same radical theology.
Exactly. It's almost like, it's like a puzzle, each piece representing a different facet of what might be a shared heresy. You got these early church fathers blaming Simon Magus as the source of all heresies, and then you see groups revering Paul in a very Gnostic light.
So you're saying that both Simon and Paul were, in different narratives, seen as instigators of radical thought?
Yes, absolutely. Scholars like Dr. Robert Price really dig into this idea, showing that the polarity we see nowadays might be the result of intense literary and theological warfare. It's like they're battling over who gets to shape the narrative of early Christianity.
Yeah. But wait, aren't these figures historically distinct? I mean, it's one thing to have, say, different roles, and another to actually be designed as ideological stand-ins.
That's the twist. Price, along with other scholars like F.C. Baur, Hermann Detering, and Stephan Huller, suggests that while Simon, Paul, and Marcion were likely distinct people, the literary treatment of Paul might have been manipulated. They argue that Simon Magus might even be a narrative proxy for Paul in certain texts.
Now that's a really controversial idea. So essentially, in some accounts, Paul doesn't really write his own letters?
Exactly. Check this out. Acts never has Paul himself, composing letters, even though that's precisely what he's famed for. Instead, the narrative has him merely delivering messages, almost as though someone else was busy crafting the theology.
Yeah, that almost sounds like a literary cover-up, like they were trying to sanitize his radical ideas and create a version that fits Orthodox norms.
Exactly. It's like they took the raw radical figure of Paul, who by some accounts was aligned with the Gnostic perspective, and reworked him into the safe apostolic hero we know from later traditions. And that's where Marcion comes in too.
Right. Because Marcion was the one who built his entire canon around Paul's writings. But here's something that really stumps me. There's no evidence of Paul's letters circulating until Marcion claims them.
That's spot on. Dr. Price proposes that the letters, especially Galatians chapters 3 to 6, might have been influenced or even originated from Marcionite circles. And then later, chapters 1 and 2 could have been tacked on to connect Paul more solidly with the apostolic tradition as narrated in Acts.
Yeah. So essentially, we're seeing Paul transformed twice. First as a radical figure embraced by some heretical groups, then rebranded to fit an Orthodox mold.
Precisely. It's almost like mythological mitosis, splitting one polarizing character into multiple versions to suit different agendas. On one hand, Simon is demonized as the archetypal heretic, and on the other, Paul is both sanitized and simultaneously co-opted by radical forces like Marcion.
Interesting, but don't you think this argument might overstate the intentionality behind these textual shifts? I mean, couldn't it simply be a case of evolving traditions rather than deliberate cover-ups?
I see your point, and it's a fair counterbalance. However, Price and his peers argue that the parallel narratives, like the miraculous acts attributed both to Peter and Paul in Acts, hint at a purposeful rewriting. They seem to be erasing Simon, just to consolidate Paul's image with that of Peter's, consolidating a unified Orthodox voice.
That does sound a bit too convenient to be merely spontaneous evolution in storytelling.
Right? It's like you have these miracle duels originally framed as Peter versus Simon Magus, And then suddenly in Acts, it's Peter and Paul as a powerful duo. It's as if the narrative was reassembled to, enforce the legitimacy of the apostolic tradition.
Yeah. And the factor of Marcion really spices things up, doesn't it? By aligning himself with Paul and rejecting the Old Testament, he's not only creating a theological divergence, but also reshaping the role of Paul as a radical theologian.
Totally. Marcion's adoption of Paul's letters serves as both validation and transformation. His canon, which excludes the Old Testament, reconstructs Paul as a true apostolic radical, unfiltered by traditional Jewish law. Yet later, the version of Paul in Acts becomes this entirely different persona, wrapped up in Orthodox conformity.
Mm-hmm. It does make you wonder how much of our understanding of early Christian theology might be a product of deliberate editorial choices rather than historical development.
Absolutely. It's like a case of narrative editing in ancient times, where the very identity of key figures was reshaped to serve the church's political and theological agendas. Imagine a modern scenario where, say, a celebrity's public image is completely reconstructed by their management team. That's kind of similar to what might have happened with Paul, Simon, and Marcion.
Right. And these reconfigurations essentially allow the church to control the story. They've got a sanitized hero, Paul, and a villain, Simon. Meanwhile, the radical thoughts that could disrupt the whole establishment get contained.
Exactly. Marcion's role, though, is almost paradoxical. He elevates Paul as the true apostle through his selective canon, yet his version of Paul highlights a theology that the Orthodox Church eventually found too dangerous to embrace.
So, what does that mean for our understanding today? Are we to see these figures as entirely manufactured, or are they just like different interpretations of the same radical undercurrent that existed in early Christianity?
Well, Price concludes that while they were distinct historical figures, their overlapping portrayal suggests that they were, in many respects, thematic reflections of a shared heretical movement. In other words, it's not that they are literally one person, but they embody facets of one radical theological strain.
Mm-hmm. And that definitely challenges the traditional narratives. It's almost like seeing a multifaceted gem where each angle reflects different ideological light.
Exactly. It's a perfect analogy. You get one gem, but depending on which side you view it from, it shines differently. Sometimes as a bright symbol of orthodoxy, other times as a daring radical critique. And the church, picks which facet to highlight.
Yeah. That brings us to another interesting point. The so-called literary cover-up. Those parallel miracles between Peter and Paul in Acts aren't random, are they?
No, they're too neatly aligned to be mere coincidence. In earlier traditions, there's a kind of narrative contest between Peter and Simon Magus. But then the text is rewritten to cast Peter and Paul as collaborators, subtly erasing any reminder of the radical origins associated with Simon.
Mm-hmm. It really underscores the power of narrative in shaping belief. By rewriting Paul's role, the early church could effectively control the theological direction.
Absolutely. And the idea of mythic mitosis comes into play here. They split an influential, disruptive idea into various character arcs: the villainous Simon, the radical yet later sanitized Paul, and the heretical rebel Marcion. It allowed the orthodoxy to maintain control while still acknowledging the potent ideas circulating at the time.
Yet, I have to respectfully challenge one point here. While the narrative rewriting theory is compelling, isn't it possible that these changes emerged organically from diverse oral traditions rather than a deliberate strategy by the church? I mean, over time, stories evolve naturally as they are passed down.
That's a solid critique. There's definitely room for interpretation here. Oral traditions do evolve organically, but the pattern and timing of these revisions, especially the targeted exclusion of certain elements like the Old Testament in Marcion's canon, suggests there was an intentional process at work.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Intentionality versus organic evolution is always a tricky balance to assess in ancient texts. Still, the persuasiveness of Price's argument makes you consider the possibility of a calculated literary cover-up.
Exactly. It might be a mix of both deliberate editorial choices and natural evolution of storytelling. The outcome, however, remains the same, a richly complex picture where Simon, Paul, and Marcion serve as different shadows of a deeper underlying heresy.
Yep. And that makes the study of early Christian texts not only fascinating, but also a humbling reminder of how history can be reshaped to fit modern narratives.
Couldn't agree more. It challenges us to always look deeper and ask, what remains hidden beneath the surface of these ancient stories?
Yeah. In the end, whether one views Simon Magus, Paul, and Marcion as entirely separate, or as interwoven reflections of one radical strand of theology, it opens up a whole conversation about power, narrative control, and the evolution of belief.
Absolutely. It's like peeling back layers of a historical onion, each layer revealing more contradictions and complexities. And that, folks, is what makes studying these texts so endlessly intriguing.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I think that discussion is exactly what keeps the conversation alive, even after thousands of years.
Right. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Let these intertwined threads of narrative and theology inspire you to dig deeper, question more, and appreciate the rich tapestry of our shared history.
And don't forget to share your thoughts and theories. Were these figures one radical force, or just different expressions of a turbulent era? Until next time.